Hi folks, my name's Gheeotine, and welcome to this week's Build Showcase, where I conclude my quest to track down what might possibly be the most powerful laptop made for gaming that came with an optical media drive. Now, some of you might reasonably ask, why? Well, long story short, I like physical media when it's an option. Plus, while I'll likely never use it to its full capacity on the go, I appreciate that if I wanted to access physical games or movies on this machine, I can. Special thanks to Lel80 for helping me find this thing. But speaking of which, what is this laptop? Introducing my new and potentially favorite piece of hardware, the Asus ROG G752VS. My particular model comes with an i7-6820HK CPU, a GTX 1070 GPU with 8 gigs of VRAM, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 memory, upgradable to 64 gigabytes, a 75Hz high-performance screen, and now including a built-in Blu-Ray drive. Just about one of the most powerful laptops of its time, with the peak of physical media. I say just about for a few caveats. You see, there were actually several sub-models of the G752VS with different orientations of CPU, GPU, and media drive. Technically, there are more powerful versions out there, but they're exceptionally rare and expensive and excessively sketchy. At the time of writing, there is one technically available on eBay, but it's $1,500 and would have to be shipped from Nigeria, which the battery would make prohibitively difficult and expensive. I know because the laptop I got in my hands was not the first one I ordered. This saga could be a whole separate video on its own, but long story short, I won an auction for one of a slightly more powerful variant that came out of Germany. After a medley of updates over the span of a month, customs would not allow the laptop to ship internationally because of the battery. But if nothing else, this was the order that helped me find a workable compromise. One of the biggest hangups was that the local listings all only had DVD drives. Then I realized I could just swap out the drive from one of the abundant spare parts suppliers out of China. A relatively simple process once I actually did it. And so, my dream laptop was obtained. And even by modern standards, this thing is kinda beastly. Looking at some reviews from when it came out, reviewers in 2017 marveled at its performance and ability to remain cool under load. Unfortunately, that's about all that was considered great about it. The size made it less than ideal from a portability standpoint, partly because they crammed so much robust cooling into the chassis, and it was expensive. Some orientations could run you up to about $3,000. By that comparison, for what I paid for the laptop today, I got it at a steal for $500 for the unit. Something that's even more impressive when taken into account is that, excluding frame gen and upscaling technologies, the GTX 1070 still has more raw horsepower than GPUs for modern laptops, often running RTX 3050s and 4050s. Again, excluding ray tracing, DLSS, and other methods. When accounting for those, yeah, this thing will lose out pretty quick. But of one last tangent before we get to some performance, let me gripe about modern movie players. I have tested the Blu-ray drive and it works fine. However, modern free media players don't often come with Blu-ray compatibility, and those that do make you jump through several hoops. I spent an entire afternoon wrangling VLC with several plugins and other players, and eventually I gave up and just shelled out $70 for one on Steam. Cyberlink Power DVD 22 Pro if you're curious. It works, and I appreciate that my Steam library carries across my devices, but I complain because I remember when Windows came with all the media players you'd ever need as part of the operating system. Whatever, I can watch my movies now. But that's only part of why I got this. I want a game as well. So, let's check some tests and my favorite heavy-hitting games in today's session of Benchmarks. Starting with the tests, we'll go with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. On high settings at 1080p, the low was 60 frames per second, but the average settled at just over 80. Considering I've seen this test weigh pretty damn heavy on full desktops, I'm already impressed. The Cyberpunk bench test was next, which is appropriate because the laptop kinda looks like the product of a cyberpunk fever dream. Anyways, the lows are just barely settled beneath 50 FPS, but an average of over 60 well and thoroughly settles any worries that I'd have about wanting to play this game on the go. I wouldn't even have to lower the resolution like the last one, but that's enough built-in bench tests. Let's move on to some favorites in my game library. Cult of the Lamb was funny. Not necessarily for the benchmarking itself, but for the fact it was the first game I was testing in the suite. As such, when I started it up, I became confused, concerned, and irritated because the game had locked itself to a 30 FPS cap, and I had no idea why. At least until I came to the NVIDIA settings menu and saw it was in power saver mode. At that point I realized I was a massive dip and forgot to plug in the laptop. No longer running off battery reserves, the game shot right up to what I expected, and as usual, the village settlement weighed pretty heavy on the processing power, averaging around 45 FPS. On the dungeon runs though, around 60 was the low whenever you entered a new room, but 100 to 120 was where we stabilized. I guess I'm just always gonna need an outlet with this thing. With Breakfast at 1080p Ultra settings, if I was going to see it struggle, it would have been at the very start of a race. That being said, if 100 FPS is struggling, then you seriously need to reassess your standards. Getting out of the pack and into the lead put us around 130 FPS. Wanting to see how the chaos of the free-for-all demolition derby would affect things, I tried one out and was definitely put into a more chaotic and stressful place, both from a gameplay and a benchmarking perspective. Depending on where I was looking, my frames could shrivel down to about 80 FPS or boost to over 140, paralleling rather nicely with the absolute anarchy of the vehicular free-for-all. Deciding to then mellow out for a bit, I put on Station to Station. Now, here's one that puts a load on. Zoomed out, placing tracks in depots, 40 to 45 FPS was a perfectly acceptable experience. Zooming in close and moving around quickly could drag things briefly into the mid-20s, but honestly, if you're moving around at a rapid pace to put your tracks down as fast as possible, you're kinda playing this game wrong. Now that I'm migrating further and further into PC territory, I'm replaying several games to have better access to game progress, one of which being Hot Wheels Unleashed 2. Having put a few levels under my belt as I tested the laptop, I felt quite comfortable with my average somewhere around 110 FPS. Lows would rarely dip to 90, and considering how much is going on in the average track environment, I could see me vibing with another playthrough on this device if needed. Deciding to put one of my most recent and hard-hitting titles into this array of benchmarks, Space Marines 2 brought us back down to Earth, which is an ironic choice of words if you think about it. The game defaulted us down to all low settings, but even so, understanding that a consistent 30 frames per second is an acceptable minimum, the performance was perfectly acceptable. It may have put into perspective how limited you'd be if you intend to play modern AAA titles, but it is at least doable, so long as you're staying away from titles with ray tracing mandates anyways. Deciding to continue with Violence in Space, I started up Doom 2016 on high settings. Amidst the ripping and tearing, frames could sink to the low 70s, but 80s to 90s were much more the norm. Fast-paced action and all the hell-slaying carnage you could possibly want. But finally, can it play Crysis? Of course. Crysis Remastered defaulted to medium settings when left to its own decision-making, and as such, never got out of triple-digit frame rates. Unrelatedly, this was the benchmarking session where I decided to see what would happen if I ran at the enemy with my cock out. It didn't go well. They shot my cock, and I just couldn't fight effectively after that. Stupid battle strategies aside, the laptop handled it beautifully. And thus concludes my hunt for my ideal laptop. It's not the newest, it's not the fastest, and it's not even the most powerful of its era, but it's the one I wanted. It plays most of the games I want, it plays movies from my media library, and it's already found a spot in my setup. That being said, come back in a week or two where I'm going to go ahead and try and build a desktop that can compete with this laptop, but for cheaper. Now if you'll excuse me, I actually need to hunt down a GPU for my Steam box here. Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Remember that I give away Steam keys with my regular weekly uploads, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact info on your YouTube profile. But as always, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.